You know how they say no good deed goes unpunished? I always thought that was just a cynical old saying. Then I saved a company from its own multi-million-dollar meltdown. And what did I get? A pay cut. Yep, this wasn't just any system. It was a huge, chaotic $27 million beast that was bleeding them dry. It crashed so regularly, you could practically set your watch by it. I was the architect they brought in, the one who was supposed to wave a magic wand, I guess. I didn't have a magic wand, but I had experience, and I poured endless nights and weekends into wrestling that monster into submission. I didn't just stabilize it, I made it solid, reliable, something they could actually build on. And my reward? A slap in the face, dressed up as a salary adjustment. They clearly figured the system would just hum along by itself once the fires were out. Boy, were they wrong. So, I decided it was time for the architecture, all that complex knowledge holding their precious system together, to walk right out the door with me. This isn't just a story about a rotten job. It's about what happens when a company completely, fatally, underestimates the quiet work that keeps everything from just falling apart. When I first set foot in that company, you could almost taste the panic in the air. That $27 million system? It wasn't just some number on a spreadsheet. It was their flagship, the very core of their operations. And it was, to put it mildly, a total train wreck. Picture a digital Frankenstein, stitched together with outdated code, clashing technologies, and years of quick fixes that only made things worse. It handled everything: customer interactions, critical back-end stuff, and it was failing spectacularly on all fronts. Outages weren't the exception, they were a daily nightmare. Data was getting corrupted, performance was so sluggish, employees were getting seriously creative trying to work around the system, which, as you can guess, just brewed up even more trouble. The financial bleeding was bad. Downtime costs, lost productivity, angry customers, and a reputation going down the drain. It was a ticking time bomb. My official title was Lead Systems Architect, but let's be real, I was more like a battlefield surgeon dropped into a war zone. Those initial briefings were a blur of stressed-out execs and frazzled engineers. They painted a grim picture, but honestly, I don't think even they fully grasped how deep the mess went. The original architects? Long gone, and the documentation, if you could even call it that, was either hilariously outdated or totally irrelevant to what the system had become. It was crystal clear this wasn't going to be a simple patch job. This needed a deep, structural overhaul. The pressure was insane from day one. Every crash, every slowdown, every ticked-off user email, it all landed, metaphorically speaking, right on my desk. My first few weeks were pure digital trench warfare, tracing ancient lines of code, mapping out forgotten connections, and trying to decode the bizarre logic that led to this mess. I wasn't just debugging, I was practically performing an archaeological dig on a live, failing system. The codebase was a maze of dead ends and weird detours. It was bloated with redundancies, pointless complexities that dragged everything down and made it incredibly fragile. Security? Let's just say, lax would be putting it generously. It was the kind of challenge that would send most seasoned pros running for the hills, but a part of me, the part that actually likes solving impossible puzzles, was stubbornly determined. I knew, even then, that if I could pull this off, it'd be a huge win. But the mountain I had to climb? Way steeper than I first thought. Previous fixes mostly involved throwing more hardware at it, or bolting on another piece of software, which just added more layers of complexity without fixing the rotten core. This wasn't about sticking on band-aids. This was about rebuilding the skeleton and the nervous system from scratch, all while the patient was, supposedly, still up and walking around. First things first, stop the bleeding. That meant putting in a really solid, proactive monitoring system. What they had was totally reactive. Something would break, alarms would go off, and then it was a mad dash. I needed to see problems before they blew up. We're talking about watching everything: server memory, CPU loads, network latency, any weird activity patterns that might scream, security issue. It was like giving the system a brand new nervous system, one that could tell us when it was stressed or sick, long before it actually collapsed. That alone took weeks of careful planning and setup, mixing various tools and custom scripts to get the full picture. At the same time, I started attacking the core architectural problems. Things like redundancy and high availability, practically non-existent. If one key server croaked, the whole house of cards came tumbling down. So I got to work designing and implementing failover systems, load balancing to spread out the traffic and prevent jams, and looking into geographically separate data centers, at least for the really critical stuff. This wasn't just about adding more servers, It was about making the system tough, able to take a punch without grinding to a halt. We started with clustered setups for key databases and application servers. Then came the really tough part: software maintenance and refactoring the architecture. This was the deep tissue surgery. We had to find and carefully cut out mountains of useless, obsolete code, digital deadwood that was killing performance and making the system a maintenance nightmare. We rooted out redundant processes, streamlined workflows, and started to bring some kind of logical order to what had been pure chaos. Security was a massive focus. We patched vulnerabilities that had been sitting open for who knows how long, tightened up access controls, and started doing regular security audits. It was like cleaning out the Augean stables, one line of code, one config file at a time. Deploying new changes had also been a high-stakes gamble, usually an all-at-once prayer that could bring the whole system crashing down. I pushed hard for, and we implemented smarter deployment strategies, things like rolling updates, where changes go out to a few servers at a time, and eventually blue-green deployments for big releases. This meant we could deploy with way more confidence, knowing we could quickly roll back if something went wrong. Solid versioning for everything and clear rollback plans became sacred. Every change was tracked, every previous state recoverable. It wasn't quick, and it definitely wasn't easy. There were so many late nights, fueled by coffee and sheer stubbornness. There were moments of pure frustration when a tiny change would send weird ripples through the system, a real testament to how tangled and fragile the old setup was. But slowly, painstakingly, things started to turn around. The daily crashes became weekly, then monthly, then pretty much disappeared. System performance, once a running joke, became snappy and responsive. Users actually started sending thank you emails instead of angry ones. The data corruption problems vanished. The company, naturally, was over the moon. The execs who used to look like they hadn't slept in weeks started smiling in meetings. They raved about the transformation, praising the miraculous turnaround. My team and I were the heroes of the hour. There were pats on the back, mentions in company newsletters, and vague promises of big things to come for those of us who'd made it happen. The $27 million system was no longer a black hole. It was an asset. It was stable, efficient, and for the first time in years, it was actually helping the business grow instead of holding it back. We'd cut downtime to almost nothing, saving them millions. Employee productivity shot up. Customer satisfaction scores climbed. I felt this huge sense of pride, not just in the tech achievement, but in the real, tangible impact on the business and the people who depended on that system every day. It felt like we'd truly slayed the beast. The false dawn, as it turned out, was dazzling. The peace and quiet after the storm lasted a few months. The system just purred along, a testament to the new architecture and the strict maintenance routines we'd put in place. My job shifted from frantic firefighting to proactive improvements, fine-tuning, and making sure the platform stayed healthy for the long haul. It was still demanding, don't get me wrong. It needed constant watchfulness and deep understanding, but the crisis was over, or so I thought. Then, the email landed. A mandatory meeting with my direct manager and someone from HR. Standard performance and compensation review, the subject line read. I walked in feeling pretty good about things. After all, I'd just saved them a fortune and turned their biggest tech nightmare into a roaring success. I was expecting to talk about a bonus, maybe a promotion, or at the very least, a hefty raise to acknowledge the value I'd delivered. The meeting kicked off with the usual pleasantries. My manager admitted I'd done excellent work stabilizing the system. The HR rep smiled that bland HR smile. Then, the bombshell. As you know, my manager started, the system is now really stable, thanks to your efforts. It's running smoothly, and the operational overhead has dropped significantly. I nodded, waiting for the "and therefore" that was supposed to lead to good news. Instead, he went on. Given that the intense crisis phase is over and the system is now in a more manageable maintenance mode, the demands of your role are seen as, well, different. Less about radical overhauls and more about ongoing upkeep. My stomach clenched. I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was headed. The HR rep then jumped in with a load of corporate jargon about reevaluating role responsibilities against current market benchmarks for stabilized environments and aligning compensation with the evolving needs of the business. It was a masterclass in delivering terrible news without actually saying the terrible words. Finally, my manager dropped the punchline. So, effective next month, your salary will be adjusted to reflect this new phase. There will be a reduction of 15%. 15%. I just stared at them. I felt this wave of heat creep up my neck. Shock, disbelief, and then this cold, hard anger started to build in my chest. I'd poured my heart and soul into that system. I'd pulled 80-hour weeks, sacrificed my personal life, and navigated incredible technical and political minefields to do what many thought was impossible. And this was my thank you? A pay cut because I'd done my job too well? Because I'd made something incredibly complex look easy to maintain? I asked them to justify it. How could they possibly explain cutting the pay of the architect, who was the single reason their $27 million investment wasn't a bottomless pit anymore? Their answers were vague and, frankly, insulting. They mumbled about budgetary constraints, even though the stabilized system was saving them way more than my entire salary. They implied that now that the heavy lifting was done, my high level of expertise wasn't quite as critical day to day. It was a stunning display of short-sightedness, a total failure to understand what it actually takes to keep a complex system stable. They were falling into that classic trap, completely undervaluing the ongoing expert work of maintenance and proactive care. They saw a calm surface and just assumed the waters underneath were just as calm, completely forgetting about the intricate machinery I had built and was still carefully tending to keep it that way. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was a complete dismissal of my contribution and my expertise. I walked out of that meeting in a total daze. The polite, corporate BS was echoing in my ears, a crazy contrast to the fury boiling up inside me. A 15% pay cut. It wasn't just the money, though that was insulting enough. It was the blatant disrespect, the sheer nerve of devaluing my work right after it had produced such huge wins for them. Did they seriously believe that the system, this complex ecosystem I had painstakingly rebuilt and was now the guardian of, would just magically run itself? Did they think stability, once you got it, was a permanent thing, like a stone statue, instead of a delicate balance that needed constant, expert attention? That evening, I replayed the whole conversation in my head, the condescending tones, the flimsy excuses. They talked about maintenance mode, like it was some trivial janitorial chore. They had absolutely no clue. The architecture I'd put in place wasn't just a set of drawings, it was a living, breathing thing. It depended on someone having an intimate grasp of all its interconnected parts, the subtle signs of its performance, the potential weak spots that could pop up with any new business need or outside threat. This knowledge wasn't written down in some simple manual they could just hand off to a junior admin. So much of it was in my head, the countless decisions, the reasons why things were designed a certain way, the potential failure points I was always watching for. A thought, cold and sharp, started to crystallize. If they valued the architect so little, then maybe they didn't deserve the architecture. If they really thought the system could run itself or be managed by someone with less specialized and cheaper knowledge, then hey, let them try. The phrase, "let the architecture walk out," began to take root. It wasn't about sabotage. I'd never intentionally wreck a system I'd built. It was about pulling the expertise they'd just told me they no longer valued at its previous price. The decision firmed up over the next couple of days. I wasn't going to argue or plead. Their minds were obviously made up, and it showed a level of ignorance I just couldn't fix. I'd built my career on delivering value and being paid fairly for it. This was a line I wasn't going to let them cross. I typed up my resignation letter. It was short, professional, straight to the point. My last day would be in 2 weeks, the standard notice. I didn't even mention the pay cut. I didn't feel like I needed to explain myself any further. They knew why. Handing it in was surprisingly anticlimactic. My manager looked a bit surprised, maybe a little put out, but not devastated. There was no counteroffer, no attempt to understand or talk it over, just a formal acceptance and a request to ensure all documentation is up to date before I left. That request alone just showed how naive they were. The kind of deep architectural understanding, that intuitive feel for the system's quirks that I had, couldn't just be documented in 2 weeks, especially when they'd just given me every reason to do the absolute bare minimum. So, that's what I did. I made sure the existing operational manuals were accurate for how things were running right then. I gave them the basic documentation, the stuff that was already there or easy to pull together, but the years of experience, the nuanced understanding of why things were built the way they were, the ability to predict potential future problems, that wasn't something you could just transfer in a few Word documents. That was the core of the architecture they had just devalued, and that was what would be walking out the door with me. They hadn't asked for a deep knowledge transfer, they hadn't budgeted for it, and they clearly didn't think they needed it. I simply did what they seemed to think was enough. My last day was pretty uneventful, a few polite goodbyes, handed over my access badges, and then I walked out into the afternoon sun. I felt a weird mix of relief and this strange, apprehensive anticipation. Relief, because I was free from a company that obviously didn't appreciate its key people. Apprehension, because I knew, with a certainty that was a bit chilling, that the stability I had fought so hard for was now living on borrowed time. I took a short break, a couple of weeks, just to decompress and clear my head. I started looking at new opportunities, feeling pretty confident that my skills and what I'd just pulled off would be valued somewhere else. And then, the first whispers started. A former colleague, someone I'd mentored, reached out for some unofficial advice on a minor glitch that had popped up. It sounded like a small configuration thing, easy to fix if you understood the underlying connections. I gave some general pointers but kept my distance. A few weeks later, another call, this time from a different engineer. A new feature deployment had gone sideways, causing unexpected slowdowns in a totally unrelated part of the system. They'd rolled it back, but nobody could quite figure out why it had happened. The reason was complicated, tied to how I designed the resource allocation and queuing to prevent exactly that kind of domino effect under specific load conditions. But trying to explain it without being there, without access to the live system and its current stats, was almost impossible. The carefully designed architectural patterns, the checks and balances I'd built in, were starting to be misunderstood or accidentally bypassed. It was becoming pretty clear that the maintenance mode they'd pictured wasn't quite working out. Small changes, things that seemed tiny on the surface, were starting to cause ripples, destabilizing other parts. New issues weren't being diagnosed or fixed with the same deep understanding. I heard they'd tried to roll out a system update suggested by a vendor, but it clashed with some custom security protocols I'd put in. Vital protocols, but not widely understood. That led to a brief but embarrassing service interruption. The company, from what I could piece together, was trying to patch these new problems as they popped up. They brought in a contractor, then another, but these folks, no matter how skilled, didn't have the history or the big picture view of the architecture. They were treating symptoms, not the underlying, increasingly messy disease. Each quick fix, each workaround, was probably just adding to the system's technical debt, making it more fragile, harder to understand, just like it had been before I got there. It was a slow unraveling, the kind that happens when the guiding hand is gone and the delicate balance is upset. The system wasn't dramatically blowing up, not yet, but the cracks were definitely starting to show, spiderwebbing their way through the foundation I had so carefully laid. They were learning the hard way that stability isn't a one-shot deal, it's an ongoing process that needs expertise. The slow unraveling went on for about 3 months. I'd landed a new gig by then, at a company that not only valued my expertise, but actively sought it out for their toughest projects. I was starting to put the whole miserable episode behind me, focusing on new challenges, new solutions. The slow unraveling went on for about 3 months. I'd landed a new gig by then, at a company that not only valued my expertise, but actively sought it out for their toughest projects. I was starting to put the whole miserable episode behind me, focusing on new challenges, new solutions. Then, one Tuesday morning, my phone started buzzing like crazy with urgent messages from several old colleagues, all at once. The tone was pure panic. "The whole system is down. No one can log in. It's a total meltdown." This wasn't one of the minor glitches or slowdowns they'd been fighting. This was catastrophic. The $27 million system, the one that was the absolute lifeblood of their operations, had completely flatlined. From what I pieced together later, a string of seemingly unrelated issues, made worse by a recent, poorly understood update, and a sudden surge in user activity, had triggered a cascading failure that just overwhelmed every redundancy I had built. The failover systems probably tripped, but the secondary systems were likely also compromised or misconfigured by then, thanks to the steady decay of architectural integrity. The initial silence from company management was deafening. I could just imagine the scenes: frantic engineers scrambling, executives in crisis meetings, customers absolutely furious. The financial bleeding wouldn't be a trickle this time. It would be a raging torrent. Every minute the system was down meant lost deals, contractual penalties, and a nosedive in customer trust. The damage to their reputation would be massive. For 2 full days, the system stayed mostly offline. They managed to bring up bits and pieces of functionality, but it was shaky and unreliable. The core problems were clearly way beyond what the remaining team or their current contractors could handle. Late on the second day of the outage, my phone rang. It was my former manager. His voice was strained, a world away from the cool corporate drone I remembered from that pay cut meeting. He skipped the small talk. "We need you," he said, the desperation practically dripping through the phone. "The system, We can't fix it. No one understands what's gone wrong. Can you come in? Name your price. Anything. This was it! The moment of vindication, maybe. But honestly, I didn't feel triumphant. More just a grim sense of, I told you so, mixed with inevitability. I let him talk, described the chaos, the mounting losses. Then, I calmly explained that I was now committed to my new employer, with significant responsibilities and contractual obligations. I mentioned that my emergency consulting rate for a disaster of this scale, for a system I was no longer intimately familiar with due to time and undocumented changes, would start at a figure that was probably 10 times my old daily rate, with a hefty minimum engagement period. I wasn't trying to be a jerk, really. It was a fair reflection of the risk and effort it would take to parachute into a mess like that. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head, the dawning horror of just how badly they had screwed up. He stammered something about needing to discuss it internally and get back to me. He never called back about that offer. They did eventually get the system back online, after nearly a week of pure chaos. I heard they had to fly in a specialist team from a major tech vendor at an absolutely insane cost. The recovery was only partial, and the system stayed unstable for months. The architecture I had built, the one that relied on deep, continuous understanding, had indeed walked out. They were left with a hollow shell, a system that looked the same on the surface, but lacked the intelligence and resilience I had woven into its core. The cost of that 1 week of downtime, plus the fees for the emergency specialists, would have paid my original salary, and the raise I actually deserved, for several years over. It's a tough lesson, and one a lot of companies seem to learn the hard way. The people who build and truly get your critical systems, they're not just interchangeable cogs. Their expertise is the invisible framework holding everything up. If you've ever felt undervalued after pouring your heart and soul into a project, or if you've seen a company make a similarly boneheaded misjudgment, I'd love to hear about it. Hit that like button if this story hit home for you. Share your own experiences in the comments below. Let's talk. And of course, if you want more stories about workplace realities and the occasional tale of karma doing its thing, make sure you subscribe to the channel. The fallout from my old company was huge, and it dragged on for a long time. Beyond the instant cash drain from that massive outage, their reputation took a serious beating. Clients who'd lived through the meltdown got nervous, and I heard whispers that they lost several major accounts. Internally, morale among the tech staff who were left just tanked. I mean, who would want to work on a critical system when management fundamentally misunderstood and devalued it? They had to sink a ton of money into rebuilding not just the system, but also the trust of their users and the market. The cost of bringing in external consultants all the time, trying to reverse engineer the stability I'd created, and then attempting to maintain it without that foundational knowledge, was just astronomical. It was a classic case of being penny-wise and pound-foolish, a lesson they learned at the multi-million-dollar scale. They tried to save a tiny fraction of my salary and ended up spending way more dealing with the totally predictable mess. As for me, walking away was one of an absolutely best decisions I ever made. My new role was challenging, rewarding, and the company culture actually respected expertise. They understood that complex systems need dedicated, knowledgeable architects, not just to build them, but to nurture and grow them. I was paid fairly, and more importantly, I was valued for the strategic thinking and deep technical insight I brought to the table. There was a certain satisfaction, I won't lie, in watching the natural consequences of their actions unfold. It wasn't about revenge in some nasty way, but more about the simple, undeniable truth that expertise has real value, and underestimating that value has a real cost. My architecture, all the knowledge and skill that kept that $27 million system stable, had indeed walked out with me, and its absence was definitely felt. It just reinforced my belief in standing up for what I'm worth. Sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is to pull your value out of a situation where it's not appreciated. It lets you find a place where it is, and it often forces a hard lesson on those who took it for granted. My new beginning was built on that idea, and it's led to a much more fulfilling and respectful professional life. This whole saga really hammered home a few key truths about the tech world, and probably about any professional field, really. First off, stability in complex systems isn't some magical self-maintaining thing. It's the result of smart design, constant watchfulness, and deep, evolving expertise. The second you devalue the people responsible for that stability, you put the entire system at risk. Secondly, proactive maintenance and solid architectural integrity, while often invisible when they're done right, are infinitely cheaper than reactive disaster recovery. Companies that cheap out on the first will inevitably pay a much, much higher price for the second. For them, it was an incredibly expensive lesson in the true cost of undervaluing critical talent and completely misunderstanding the nature of the very systems their business depended on. Maybe they learned something about proper knowledge management, about not letting crucial understanding live in just one or two heads without a serious plan to keep and share it. For me, it was an affirmation. Know your worth, and don't be scared to walk away from situations where that worth is ignored. The architecture of your career is just as important as any system you build. Make sure it's built on a foundation of respect and fair value, because ultimately, you are your most important asset.